Elizabeth Holmes claimed to revolutionize medicine, but the machines didn't work. You feel the weight of that promise and how it rearranged lives, investments, and trust. And you start to wonder how so many brilliant people could be fooled so thoroughly. The opening is almost cinematic. A 19-year-old engineering dropout starts a company in 2003 with a single, audacious aspiration to shrink lab testing down to a single droplet of blood. You follow the glittering promise because you want to believe in better healthcare, faster answers, and cheaper tests, and Elizabeth Holmes offered a future that felt inevitable. But here is where it gets interesting. Because the dots between the promise and reality are not just gaps, they are deliberate silences and constructed scenes meant to convince you that impossibility had become fact. You first encounter the core of the pitch: one drop of blood can replace vials and hospital visits. The claim seemed almost holy in its simplicity because it promised to democratize medical testing and prevent avoidable deaths with early detection at home or at the corner pharmacy. That idea, distilled to a single sentence, propelled Theranos from an idea into a cultural phenomenon and later into a $9 billion valuation. You watch how the narrative becomes an investment thesis, and you begin to see the allure of bold disruption in Silicon Valley culture, where audacity often substitutes for verification. What happened next will shock you, because the technology that underpinned this religion of miniaturization never performed at the scale or accuracy the company claimed it could. You meet Elizabeth Holmes, who curated an image as carefully as any product launch, and the image sold the idea as much as any data. She adopted a black turtleneck wardrobe inspired by a tech icon, and cultivated a low, authoritative voice that made her sound older and more serious than she was. The persona became a brand, and that brand made it easier for investors to gift her the benefit of the doubt. You should not underestimate how much presentation matters, because the story of Theranos is both a technological and theatrical success until the theater collapses. Investors were investing in a future narrated by a charismatic leader, and they placed their trust in her performance just as much as they did in supposed lab results. You learn that the board of directors reads like a who's who of establishment power, and you will be surprised how it lent credibility that technology did not deserve. Names like Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, and Jim Mattis adorned corporate filings and investor decks, and their presence created an aura of geopolitical and institutional trust that discouraged questions. This was not accidental. Theranos leveraged prestige to immunize itself against scrutiny from many corners. You must understand how reputational authority can function as a proxy for technical validation in high-stakes ventures, because the board's gravitas often substituted for lab reports. The effect was subtle and dangerous, making it easier for the company to attract hundreds of millions of dollars from people who assumed oversight was real. You are told about the money, and the numbers alone make you dizzy with disbelief and envy in equal measure. Major investors like Rupert Murdoch, the Walton family, and Larry Ellison collectively funneled over $700 million into Theranos, inflating a private valuation near $9 billion by 2014. On paper, Elizabeth Holmes was worth billions, and the company was on its way to upending healthcare norms worldwide. You need to see how money can amplify belief, because once big names and big checks appear, other people find it harder to be skeptical without feeling foolish or missing out. Investment became an echo chamber where social proof trumped rigorous due diligence, and where the fear of being left behind overpowered caution. You should be asking how a company can claim to run 200 different medical tests from pinprick samples and not produce reproducible data. The promise included cholesterol, thyroid, and infectious disease panels, all allegedly doable with minuscule blood volumes. And those capabilities would have required breakthroughs in chemistry and hardware that Theranos never publicly validated. The more tests they promised, the more mathematical and biological impossibilities piled up behind their doors. You feel the tension because medicine obeys the laws of chemistry and statistics, and novelty alone cannot override sensitivity limits or reagent requirements. When a device claims to compress multiple complex assays into a singular platform, independent verification becomes not just prudent but essential for patient safety. You discover that the company created convincing demonstrations to mask their technological shortcomings, and deception turned into an operational strategy. Presentations to investors and partners often used carefully staged demos that avoided the messy reality of inconsistent results or device failures. Staff were instructed to steer external observers toward scripted scenarios and to hide the fact that larger conventional analyzers did most of the real testing. You begin to understand how performance can replace proof when secrecy and narratives win over transparency. And you realize that the demos were less about educating and more about seducing. What happened next will shock you, because this sleight of hand reached into partnerships with national brands and mainstream distribution channels. You need to look at the Walgreens deal to see how illusions scale into real-world consequences and how retail credibility fed the myth. In 2013, Walgreens announced a partnership with Theranos to roll out wellness centers in hundreds of stores. and the announcement implied clinical validation and regulatory readiness that did not exist. Customers showed up expecting quick, accurate tests at pharmacy counters, and the retail chain trusted Theranos, assurances more than independent lab audits. You should ask how a multinational corporation signed a deal based largely on promises and private demonstrations, because the consequences were not just reputational but medical and legal. The partnership amplified Theranos' public profile and exposed more patients to ambiguous and unreliable results. You will be struck by the hidden reality inside Theranos labs, where company culture enforced secrecy and punished skeptics. Employees who raised concerns found themselves marginalized, reassigned, or fired, and internal quality control systems were often bypassed to preserve the illusion of flawless performance. Tests were sometimes diverted to conventional analyzers and then rebranded as proprietary results, creating a dangerous lie that impacted patient care. You must recognize the human cost because patients received incorrect or delayed diagnoses while employees struggled with moral dilemmas. 2 of those employees later became crucial figures in exposing the truth, and their decisions changed everything for the company and for you as a watcher of the story. You meet the whistleblowers whose bravery fractured the illusion and forced the world to look closer at the claims. Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung worked inside Theranos and witnessed discrepancies between promotional materials and lab practice. And their choices to speak out set off a chain reaction that journalism could not ignore. These were not grandstanding figures, but young professionals trapped between corporate loyalty and the moral duty to protect patients. You will respect the difficulty of their position because coming forward meant risking careers, lawsuits, and retaliation. And yet they persisted until investigative reporters took notice. Their accounts provided the raw evidence needed to pry open corporate spokes and to let sunlight begin disinfecting the rot beneath. You are introduced to investigative journalism that changed the course of the company, and the Wall Street Journal story functions like a detective novel, Turning Point. Reporter John Carreyrou published a meticulously sourced exposé in 2015 that questioned the accuracy of Theranos, testing and laid out internal practices that contradicted the company. As public claims, the article compiled interviews, documents, an expert analysis that made the unthinkable obvious. The devices often produced unreliable results. You will notice how the combination of rigorous reporting and courageous insiders created a force that even prestige and money could not withstand. What happened next will shock you, because the company's public decline accelerated as regulators, partners, and investors all reevaluated their relationships. You watch corporate responses try to spin and resist, and those defenses quickly frayed under scrutiny and official oversight. Theranos attempted to discredit critics and to assert that their technology was under regulatory review. But regulators like the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services began inspections that revealed major deficiencies. Lab operations were found to be unsafe and non-compliant, and the company's license and certificates were put at risk. You should understand how regulatory pressure functions as a corrective when market signaling fails, because government oversight stepped in where investors and partners had not. The company's attempts to control narratives could not erase the mounting evidence of systemic problems and patient harm. You follow Walgreens and other partners as they pull back from the deal and seek to limit their exposure. After regulatory findings and public outrage, Walgreens terminated its partnership and removed Theranos centers from stores, signaling a public repudiation of the company's claims. Safeway and other partners also distanced themselves, leaving thousands of patients and employees in doubt and the company isolated within months. You feel the unraveling because once institutional partnerships fracture publicly, the company's lifelines vanish and legal liabilities surge. Investors who had once been seduced by the promise now confronted a wreckage of unmet expectations and potential fraud. You follow the legal path as federal investigators and prosecutors take over and begin building a criminal case. The Department of Justice opened inquiries into potential securities and wire fraud, and the company's board and executives faced subpoenas and testimony demands. The narrative had shifted from corporate embarrassment to potential criminality as patient harm and investor deception became legal responsibilities. You sense the gravity rise because criminal charges are not about mismanagement. They are about deliberate deceit and the manipulation of investor and consumer trust. For the first time, the theater of Silicon Valley was meeting the letter of the law. You arrive at the criminal indictment and trial, where performance and evidence collided in public for the first time. Elizabeth Holmes and former President Ramesh's Sunny Balwani faced charges alleging they orchestrated multi-million-dollar schemes to defraud investors and patients. And juries would be asked to determine whether the failures were incompetence or cold deceit. The courtroom became a theater of ethics, data, and testimony that distilled years of secrecy into moments of truth. You must pay attention to how the trial parsed technical claims into legally admissible facts, because expert witnesses, internal emails, and lab data became the currency of justice. What happened next will be decisive, because juries would need to decide between plausible ambition and criminal intent. You watch the trial reveal unsettling details about how the company presented results and how executives communicated about tests that they allegedly knew were unreliable. Evidence included internal messages, emails boasting about valuations, and testimony from former employees who described coerced secrecy and manipulated demonstrations. The prosecution painted a picture of repeated deception that extended beyond bravado into systematic misrepresentation to investors and partners. You feel the moral clarity emerging because the trial translated corporate myths into measurable harms for patients and financial losses for investors. This was not merely a cautionary tale about overpromise. It was an examination of where ambition crosses into deliberate fraud. You follow the verdict, which shook both Silicon Valley and the legal system with its implications for founder accountability. In 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy, signaling a rare legal rebuke to a tech founder formerly idolized by many. The conviction underscored that charisma and narrative cannot shield executives indefinitely when evidence of intentional misrepresentation mounts before juries. You should consider how this case rebalanced questions about entrepreneurial license and legal responsibility, because the verdict set a precedent for how courts might treat founders who cross ethical and legal lines. The world watched as the glamorous veneer peeled away to expose criminal culpability. You read about sentencing, where the rhetoric of regret met real consequences for choices that had wide impacts. Elizabeth Holmes was sentenced in 2022 to an 11-year prison term, an outcome that balanced punishment with public expectation and legal standards. The sentence reflected the seriousness with which prosecutors and judges treated deception that endangered patients and defrauded investors of hundreds of millions of dollars. You must imagine the message this sends to leaders across industries, because it indicates that societal tolerance for move fast. Break things. Rhetoric has limits when human lives and public trust are at stake. The legal consequences closed a chapter on corporate myth-making that had gone too far. You consider the people most affected, patients who received faulty results and employees who lived in fear of speaking up. Some patients altered medical treatment based on Theranos reports, which can mean the difference between life and death in medicine, and the emotional toll is both private and profound. Employees who tried to raise alarms often faced retaliation, and many left the industry with scars from corporate silence and intimidation. You should feel the human consequences, because beyond valuation headlines and court filings are lives that were altered by deception and systemic failure. The story of Theranos is thus both a financial scandal and a human tragedy with long-lasting consequences. You must wrestle with Silicon Valley culture and its complicity in this collapse, because the ethos of disruption sometimes rewards spectacle rather than substance. Fake it till you make it became an instruction manual for some and a moral hazard for others. And investors often prioritized moonshot narratives over meticulous replication studies or third-party validation. The Theranos story exposes how venture capital hunger and prestige beyond expertise can create fertile ground for exaggerated claims. You will see that systemic incentives matter, because when capital rewards bold narratives and punishes cautious, incremental progress, startups may feel pressure to misrepresent capabilities. The moral question becomes not only about individual fraud, but about the structures that incentivize risky deception. You notice how due diligence failures occurred at many levels, from investors to partners to regulators who were sometimes slow to act. Many sophisticated investors invested based on demos and reputational validation rather than independent lab audits or peer-reviewed data. And this lack of technical scrutiny enabled the company to grow for years without producing reproducible evidence. Walgreens and other partners made decisions that looked reasonable at face value, but ultimately ignored critical verification steps. You have to ask what structural reforms could prevent similar failures. Because improving transparency, auditability, and regulatory oversight might have stopped this scandal earlier, a solution is not to squash innovation, but to align incentives with accountability, so that grand promises face rigorous technical proof before wide distribution. You reflect on the role of media and myth in shaping public perception and financial outcomes, because powerful stories travel faster than slow science. Coverage that lionized founders, without demanding replication, contributed to the myth machine that elevated Theranos. And the later investigative journalism that exposed the truth demonstrates the important corrective role of persistent reporting. The tension between hype-driven coverage and investigative depth is a central moral of this narrative. You must be wary of narratives that are too neat or emotionally satisfying, because complex technological claims often require skepticism and time to verify. When you see mesmerizing founders and elegant promises, ask for the data that proves those claims beyond rehearsed presentations. You should also consider the legal precedent this creates for holding founders accountable when they intentionally deceive stakeholders. The conviction showed that charisma and vision are not legal shields against misrepresentation, and that the law can and will intervene when public health and investor capital are at stake. This recalibration is significant for entrepreneurs and investors who have previously assumed that market forces alone would police excesses. You ought to recognize that the legal system will not replace good business practices, but it can deter the most egregious deceptions and protect the public from harmful experiments presented as innovation. The lesson is that ethical boundaries matter as much as innovation in preserving public trust. You arrive at the conclusion where the Theranos saga becomes a cautionary tale about belief, power, and verification in modern innovation. The story is not just about one charismatic founder or one fraudulent company. It is about how systems that reward storytelling over evidence can enable large-scale deception. If you are building, investing, or regulating in the space between technology and health, you must insist on transparency that protects patients first and profits second. You are left with a philosophical twist. Progress depends on imagination, but survives on truth, and without rigorous proof. Even the brightest visions can become dangerous illusions. The final thought is this: if the future of medicine depends solely on compelling narratives, then you have built an industry of stories, not science. You end with an invitation to take the larger lesson into the world of startups, investment, and public policy with a clear, modern relevance. Demand reproducible evidence, support whistleblowers who risk careers for the public good, and structure incentives so that validation precedes mass deployment in healthcare technologies. If you are an investor or executive, require independent verification, and remember that real innovation is patient and accountable rather than merely persuasive. You close by thinking about trust in the information age and the fragile architecture that sustains it, and then you act on that reflection. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe.